Good morning and welcome to the forum. My name is Malcolm Clemens Young. I'm the Dean of Grace Cathedral. It's such a blessing to have you all here today. In the fall of 2016, we invited to the forum Jeff Kozycki, the director of the City Hall's then new Department of Homelessness. We had Audrey Cooper, the San Francisco Chronicle's editor-in-chief. And we also had Ken Reggio, the executive director of Episcopal Community Services, which has been providing homelessness services for over 35 years. It was an interesting conversation, and the place was packed. And at the very end, we had questions from homeless people who wanted to clarify some questions that they had. It was an amazing event. This year, though, is the theme of the cathedral is the year of the body. And so we've been thinking about all sorts of different kinds of bodies, how we treat bodies, and this is part of that conversation for us. How do we treat the bodies of homeless people? We're fortunate to have as our guest today the Chief Executive Officer of Hamilton Families, nationally recognized for pioneering homelessness prevention and rapid rehousing programs. She is locally and nationally recognized as a dynamic nonprofit leader with more than 20 years' expertise in public policy and community planning. She has served directly under the mayors of both San Francisco and Oakland and was the executive director of the Hope SF Initiative, a public housing and neighborhood revitalization effort. Please join me in welcoming Tomiquia Moss.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for coming so early on a Sunday morning. We're so blessed to have you here.
I'm honored to be here.
Yeah. I look at all the extraordinary things that you've done and all the great places you've been and all the responsibility you have. And I wonder sometimes about that little girl, Tomiquia. What was she like? What were your parents like? Who formed you? What did you dream of being when you were a little kid? And what is the connection between now and then?
Oh, gosh, that was a long time ago.
Yeah.
So I was raised by my grandparents. My mother and father both passed when I was very young. So by the time I was 3 years old, my grandparents had adopted my sisters and I, and I was born in Cleveland, Ohio, and we moved out to a farm just about 45 minutes east of Cleveland. When I think about the little Tomiquia, I realized that I was really trying to figure out how do I support the gift of my grandparents who kept my sisters and I together after my parents passed, integrated us into their family. And it really, I didn't have the words then to think about sort of humility and taking care of family, and how much community meant to my grandparents, and that has become sort of the formation of who I am as an adult. I think that recognizing the unconditional love and support that my grandparents have provided for my family for generations of our family grounded me in sort of my sense of responsibility of it's not just about you. It really is about taking care of the people you care about, taking care of the people you don't know yet, and how do we make this a much more inclusive community for everyone. So I learned that really young, and it's really guided who I've become in the world.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because now here you are taking care of all those little girls and boys who don't have a place.
Go figure.
Yeah, so isn't that amazing?
It is, and I think about that often in terms of that sort of caregiving and caretaking role and how undervalued it really is in terms of making sure that we don't, it's fine to, take care of yourself and your family and all of the folks that are in your circle, but our world is actually stronger when you open that up and use that philosophy to support others. And so I'm really grateful for that.
Yeah. Yeah, I completely agree. I've been reading this history of the diocese lately. So a history of all the different programs for orphans in the city and housing for elderly women, and in each generation there's just such different programs, and they kind of come and they go because the problems are different.
Yes.
When they had a different approach to how to take care of orphans that the city government was in charge of, and then our orphanages closed. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit just just about a history of homelessness, just like, what it's meant in the city, just how things have changed over time. I mean, I just think of how much it's changed since I was a boy in the 70s.
No, that's a great question. I wonder though if we could take a moment. I want to just sort of acknowledge one of the most remarkable public servants I've ever had a chance to meet, who we lost on Friday,
yeah.
Our public defender, Jeff Adachi.
Oh, I know.
I wondered if we could just take a moment of
our
recognition.
house was in mourning. My wife was part of the Asian Law Caucus.
Yes.
And so they sent emails, everything. It's
just devastating news. And when I was starting the Community Justice Center, I got to work really closely with Jeff, and throughout the years of our work, overlapping together, and I just wanted to, it's one of those moments when you think about what we're all here to do,
right.
And just pausing to recognize somebody who made such great contributions to the city of San Francisco and the Bay Area, frankly.
Yeah, and it reminds me so often, we have all these connections in our life, and we're working so much on the task, and sometimes we don't appreciate one another in the way that we should.
That's
so
right.
You're right. I'm so glad that you brought that into this space today.
Thank you.
A dedicated civil servant.
Yeah, so, when I think about the evolution of homelessness in our communities across, not just in San Francisco, but across the country, it makes me connect the dots around what is actually perpetuating homelessness.
Right. That's a great question.
What are the forces that continue to have an impact on what happens to people in our communities? And I think what we've seen, certainly over the last 25 years, is our federal government beginning to disinvest, excuse me, in housing.
Right.
Our Housing and Urban Development Department at the federal level provides resources across the country for our folks who need support around housing. And those funds have decreased steadily over the last 25 years.
Along with increasing inequality, too.
Precisely. So then you couple that with wages remaining flat across this country in terms of low-wage jobs or middle-wage jobs, and sort of the accessibility and the ladder to be able to start in a low-wage job and move yourself into higher-paying employment.
Right.
I think that we also have a wealth gap that has grown exponentially in the Bay Area, particularly.
Right. So tax policies in general, but here in particular.
I actually, there's a lot of data about this issue and how the Bay Area, because of our incredible job growth, but the jobs really being at the top 10% of the segment.
Right.
Those folks who are vulnerable in our communities, or those folks who are working to stay out of homelessness, are falling further and further down the list in terms of who has access to that wealth and who has access to opportunity. And so we've seen a spike in homelessness, I think, because those external forces continue to put pressure on people who are just trying to make it. And we saw, particularly at Hamilton Families, after the Great Recession of 2008, we saw a doubling of family homelessness here in San Francisco, because many folks who were already struggling and maintaining their lives, when the recession hit, they were the first to be impacted. And so it's been really difficult for folks to recover from that, because many of the jobs that were added back to the economy were low-wage jobs. So when people talk about what are the solutions to homelessness and what conditions are contributing to those, we also think about the opioid crisis that the United States is experiencing right now, the mass incarceration of Black and brown people. All of those components are public policy failures that exacerbate homelessness and the conditions of poverty. And so I think it's important for us to connect the dots when we think about what is causing the problem and how do we solve it.
Right, and it's so helpful too, just thinking into the future too.
Absolutely.
About these policies that have unintended externalities to these outcomes that we didn't expect. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about almost like kind of like the state of homelessness right now in California. I think so many of us we're not close to the the figures and the facts, and so we see homelessness just in a lived experience on our way here and there, but we don't really have a sense of the big picture. So I'm thinking just like the numbers of people, the different programs that we have to address it,
Sure.
and even just like their geographical distribution too.
Sure.
I mean, I just feel like in smaller communities that I go to now in Northern California, like Chico and places like that, I see a lot more homelessness than I did like 20 years ago.
Yeah, so I guess I would start by saying that California is not the only place experiencing an increase in people experiencing homelessness.
Yeah.
We've seen this happening across the country.
And internationally probably too, right?
Nationally, exactly. Yeah. DC, Boston, many cities that this was not a challenge in their communities are now seeing the similar realities to what we experience in California. Lots of it because housing costs across this country is going up. Incomes, as I said, remain flat. So just the math in and of itself is not working for more and more people.
Right.
But in California, it's a sobering reality that a quarter of unsheltered people in the United States live in the state of California. And so this governor, many mayors, residents, other stakeholders recognize the acuity of what is actually happening in our state when you have the fifth largest economy in the world, but the disparate divide between folks with resources and folks without is quite stark.
Yeah.
And so I think it's really important for us to recognize, again, the conditions that are perpetuating what's happening in the Bay Area and in San Francisco. We do HUD requires us to do a biannual survey. It's called the point in time count to give us a sense of how many folks are actually experiencing homelessness on any given night.
Yeah.
So many folks, it has just passed, so many folks have volunteered to do that in our communities. And it's an imperfect count, but it certainly gives us a sense of what is the scale of the challenge. And I think San Francisco has hovered around 6,000 to 10,000 people experiencing homelessness for the last decade.
Right.
And in fact, I think because the city and county of San Francisco has recognized that this is one of the biggest issues of our time, has really focused on what to do. And it's allowed some of the numbers to not increase, but we have a humanitarian crisis in our community. And
Right.
I think it is most acute when people are walking across their neighborhoods, because San Francisco is 49 square miles.
Right.
And we have per capita, you see humans and people experiencing homelessness much more than you might in communities that are larger.
Right,
so the
right.
geography and sort of has some to do with the visibility
Right.
of the challenge. But what we also know is that many communities who are experiencing homelessness, like families, like young people, are much less visible. We don't have families as much unsheltered.
Right.
Many of the families that we serve are doubled and tripled up on couches or in single room occupancy hotels in their vehicles. And so young people don't often identify as homeless because
Right,
they're
right.
staying with friends and moving throughout the Bay Area. So part of what we try to do is recognize that homelessness is not monolithic. There isn't one profile,
Right,
right,
exactly,
of who is homeless, how they got there, and what we must do to intervene to better support our neighbors. And so it's really important to me as we try to look at solutions to make sure that we are not, that we bring empathy to the people that we work with and live in community with, but also that we have a lot more flexibility in terms of how we support folks to resolve their homelessness.
Right, exactly. One of the questions that someone had for me was, what is the just like the role of drugs and alcohol, and then also mental illness. We talked about the poverty structure.
Sure.
Can you talk a little bit about the larger picture in those areas?
So I feel like substance abuse and behavioral health challenges are real for people experiencing homelessness. It's not the cause, though. I think that there's a correlation between people who are on our streets who are now in crisis and experiencing situations that we can't imagine. And if there was a mental health issue or a substance use issue, that becomes much more acute when they're on the streets and trying to figure out how they're going to survive. But it's not causal. So I think it's important for folks to recognize that mental health issues don't make you homeless. They exacerbate your condition once you are experiencing homelessness. I also think that the broader mental health system has failed our communities. When Reagan was the president and decided to close mental health hospitals, right, which wasn't necessarily a bad public policy, but what happened excuse me, was that there was no replacement for how communities, cities, states might actually have a much more intact mental health response for people experiencing mental health issues. The stigma of mental illness is still quite profound in our communities, particularly in African American communities and other ways. And so I think, again, there is always a systems connection. By the time you see someone having a mental health crisis on the street, so much has happened for that person, and so many things have failed to intervene that it's super easy to blame the person in front of you and be like, what is going on? But what we think is important is to also have a moment to look at what has systematically occurred for the individual that's in front of you, and how do we respond a bit more upstream to the mental health system failures that exist. And then I think on the substance abuse side, you know, we know that the criminalization of substance abuse has also impacted who is experiencing homelessness. When the crack epidemic happened in communities throughout the country in the 80s, you had mass incarcerations of African American folks who were given 3 strikes for in ways that heroin and cocaine were not. And so I think, again, it's really important to contain this conversation in some of the not only unconscious but conscious structural racism in terms of what has happened related to substance use, you know, the underground economy related to what's going on with drugs in this country. And so I just say that because I think it's super easy to be like, oh, that person's on drugs, we got to figure out how to get them off drugs. We also have a system where the stay for substance use treatment has been reduced because there's been a disinvestment in treatment. So 90 days is typically not enough time for people who have severe substance use disorders to get the treatment that they need. It takes years. But that's not how the investments are happening in our communities. And so I think it's really important to recognize that substance abuse and mental health issues play a role in homelessness. It's not the cause, but we have to do a better job of making sure that our systems are responsive, that they're accessible, and that they're culturally competent in terms of who they're serving in our communities and how.
Thank you so much. I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about Hamilton Families and, you know, just kind of what's happening there now, too.
Absolutely. So Hamilton Families, we are 34 years old. We started in the basement of a church called the Hamilton Church in the Haight District. We were really the sort of first family homelessness shelter in the city. And the organization has grown and evolved to be one of the most preeminent organizations that is serving families experiencing homelessness in our city. We provide emergency, transitional, and housing services for families experiencing homelessness. We have a really robust children's program. We know that the effects of homelessness are quite profound for children, both social, emotionally, as well as academically. So we pay a lot of attention to how do we support families and their children through the crisis of homelessness. And we recognize that you spoke earlier about the conditions that change around homelessness.
Right.
Often.
Yeah.
Hamilton has always been an innovator in trying to respond to those changes and making sure that we don't abandon families along the journey, that we figure out how to adapt our service models, how to provide additional services if that is required, to make sure that we can see families toward long-term stability. And we, 15 years ago was the organization that started sort of looking at the housing first
Well,
model.
yeah, right, exactly. Ken Reggio talked
Yeah,
about
exactly.
that. That's great.
Which was amazing, and I'm so proud of that, because when I was a social worker back in the day, one of the things that we always worked on was how to get people housing ready. Let's deal with their mental health issues. Let's get them a job. Let's intervene in every other way
that's a
possible,
huge job.
right? And then get them housing. And so I think Hamilton sort of introduced the idea of flipping that on its head and getting folks housed first, and then figuring out how to wrap around the services that they need to stay housed. And that's now the national best practice. So Hamilton Families has always been an innovator in how we do the work.
What surprised you when you came on board there? I mean, what was new? I mean, because you've been so close to these issues.
Yeah.
I can't imagine what it was like the first day you come into your office and, start looking around and start thinking about what's going on.
Well, I don't know if I'd say I was surprised, but the sheer dedication of the staff who work on behalf of our families was extraordinary. And it was just so palpable to be in their company and recognize how committed folks are to this work, and how it was my job as the CEO to make sure that they felt supported as employees,
exactly.
and doing what I could to figure out how do we get our staff competitive wages when there are choices for people to do work in their careers, and they're choosing to do human services work. So how do we make Hamilton the best employer that we can be? I'm always in awe of the resilience of the people who we work with. Families, young people, our children. When you are experiencing a crisis of that magnitude in your life, for it to be a rare, brief, and non-occurring event, you have to work really hard for that not to become a part of your identity.
Right.
And to see families resolve their homelessness and go on and live their lives and thrive, it's why I do this work.
Yeah, that's great.
And I was just so overjoyed to see that Hamilton is delivering on that promise every single day, and I'm honored to
Is there a
support
story
them.
that you think of just when you think of just like the people you're serving that you might want to share with us, just about a family that you meet through Hamilton Families? It's
Gosh, there are so many.
I figure there's just like a zillion. Like, tell me, you could ask me, I'll tell a story about somebody at Grace Cathedral, and there's like,
I know. I was like,
stop.
do you keep a list? It's amazing. I mean, again, I think overall, I'm just inspired by the resilience and perseverance of folks who we work with. A story that comes to mind actually is a woman who moved to the Bay Area. She was an artist, a musician, and really an entrepreneurial spirit. She and her husband moved here from North Carolina, and they had 6 children.
Wow.
And when they got to San Francisco, they were about to embark on their next adventure together, and her husband was injured on the job and was not able to continue working. And so it put them all in a really vulnerable position. And they, of course, the Bay Area is cost prohibitive for a lot of people.
Right.
And when you're just starting to get roots here, it was really difficult for them to get their footing. And so they got connected to Hamilton Families, and we were able to support them through our eviction prevention supports. We were able to work with them on providing them some rental subsidy for a short period of time, so that so her husband could sort of recover, the children could still be supported. And these, as I said, these folks are incredibly just supportive of their own family unit. So whatever my staff could do to just sort of reinforce all the amazing because it's really devastating to your spirit when those kinds of things happen, and it's hard to sort of have dignity through a crisis like that.
Right.
And I know that this particular family felt like we were able to give them that we honored their assets as a family. We have a really strong empowerment model at Hamilton Families where we don't make it about me. How am I going to help you, and what can I give you? Right. It's what are the assets, what are the needs of the family, and how do we bring opportunity to those needs so that the family can take it from there. Right. And this particular family was able to find housing. They are now thriving. The mom is an author now. She's written a children's
that's
book.
Great.
Her kids are amazing. And so again, it's just moments like that where we're not riding with people forever. We work with folks when they need us, and then they take it from there.
And sometimes that moment of just intervening at the right moment can help prevent a total catastrophe.
Exactly. And imagining how, if organizations like ours and some of the others here in this community weren't there, how much worse it would be for folks. So it's really prideful for us to partner with families in that way.
That's so great. Such great to hear about that. Jeff Kozitzki, as I mentioned, was here as one of our forum guests.
Yes.
And I know that he was part of Hamilton Families. And I wonder if you can, he was just embarking on this new adventure
Absolutely.
at the city. And I wonder if you can just comment on just like what he's doing, what his challenges are. How are things going? I was like, what's the next chapter update on how things are going for him?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So the first thing is, Jeff and I have been colleagues for a really long time.
Yeah.
And, having worked in government and knowing how complicated it is to start a new department in a big old bureaucracy like San Francisco, I support him in his efforts to do that. And I know it has been challenging to sort of have a mandate of responding to one of the most important issues of our time while building a team and building a department. So I think that they're still very much in that space where they're trying to get all of their systems up and running so that it can actually be a resource for the organizations like Hamilton doing the work. So I think, that's been an evolution and a challenge. I think one of the wonderful things that Jeff has been able to start is our coordinated entry system. Families was launched back in October of 2016. Single adults in November, and I know youth is on its way. And coordinated entry is a requirement of HUD, Housing and Urban Development Department, that has a requirement that all jurisdictions across the country have one streamlined system in which to serve folks experiencing homelessness. So it's a sort of a technology solution that you have a database, one assessment tool, and it allows folks to actually come into one door and be assessed. We now have access points throughout the city that allow folks to be able to come in, get that assessment, and then be triaged to the appropriate services. And I think Jeff's ability to get those systems off the ground has been tremendous because it will allow us to have a much better way of customizing the services and supports that people need. I think one of the challenges, though, is that with the implementation of any new system, there are always glitches and
especially technology.
Ooh, yes. So I think it'll be really helpful over time for those systems to mature and reach their full potential, because ultimately they will be helpful. But I think the onboarding and implementation has been a struggle because the system isn't intact. I think that's part of San Francisco and the Bay Area's challenge is we don't have a consolidated plan.
I think about that a lot, especially
how
about
to
just different
tackle this
municipalities.
issue.
Especially, you worked in the mayor's office in San Francisco and Oakland. It seems like a regional problem that we're addressing in a municipal fashion.
That's right.
I don't know what you have to say about that, or if there's a better way to do this. But maybe that's what that HUD requirements are about, is trying to make it more uniform.
Yeah, I think that's a start, right? I think that local jurisdictions, because of the federal disinvestment in housing across this country, in 2012, Governor Brown at the time eliminated redevelopment, which was a tool that cities and counties use to build affordable housing at all income levels from 0 to 120% area median income. And so when those tools left, then local jurisdictions were kind of left on their own to figure out how to solve their housing crises.
Right.
And so it's really important for us to think about, again, what is the state level response? What is the region's response? We have a region of 101 cities that do everything differently.
Yeah, everything from Saratoga to
Come
San
on.
Rafael to Alameda to Oakland.
Yes.
Yeah, they're right.
And they're all independent agents who want to solve and do the thing.
Right.
Local control matters. And so when you think about how do you knit together a response to homelessness across the region, the first step is recognizing that homelessness is regional.
Right.
People are not just staying in San Francisco and not crossing the bridge. They get on BART, they go stay with their friends, they come back to San Francisco, they go to Antioch. So how do we have a much more responsive system that allows for you, if you become homeless in San Francisco, but you get housed in Oakland, how do we make sure that you don't become homeless in Oakland?
Right.
And so there are our technology systems, we hope, will eventually be able to talk across geographies.
Yeah.
And I think the decision makers and stakeholders also need to be working together to coordinate our efforts and to understand, okay, what is Oakland doing in terms of the cabin communities and the temporary response to homelessness, and how does Concord learn from what other jurisdictions are doing?
That seems so interesting to me too. I mean, you touched on it when you're talking about a little bit about housing first.
Yes.
I mean, what are other kind of like technologies for addressing homelessness that like housing first that you see in other areas, and what are other places in the country like Houston and Washington learning from California, and what are we learning from them? Like, how's the technology for addressing homelessness changing?
So I wouldn't limit it just to a technology response.
Yeah.
I think
I guess what I mean by technology is
the
not like
infrastructure.
Got
the
it. Whole thing.
Thank
just like the mental structure.
Got it.
Yeah.
Well, I think, again, part of it is recognizing the connection between the acute crisis that you have in your communities when people are in encampments and on the streets, and what is our response to that. That's actually a different response than it might be to a family who's doubled and tripled up living on their friend's couch.
Right.
And so I think what jurisdictions like Houston has done is said, okay, how do we create a responsive and resilient emergency response system for people acutely experiencing homelessness on our streets, right? Shelters, right? London Breed has talked to, our mayor, London Breed, has talked about an increase in shelter beds. Part of the solution is if people are living on the streets, they need to actually have a place to be indoors if we're going to start working on a path to permanent housing. And so we've not invested in shelters in many communities across the state because we've invested in permanent housing solutions. And I think what we're trying to do is none of these things should be siloed. It actually takes all of the interventions together to actually have an impact that can be scaled and that can be implemented across jurisdictions. So we have a shortage of shelter beds. We have more than, 7,000 folks in our community who are living unsheltered, and we only have 1,400 shelter beds. That's not enough, right? We can't. So investing there first, but not only, is part of the strategy. The other thing we know is that prevention is the best intervention for homelessness. If someone is experiencing an economic crisis, being able to provide rental support, utility bill payments, paying grandma the PG&E bill so that grandma's not evicted, so that the house can stay intact. Those kinds of interventions, we spend more than 50% of our budget on prevention measures to make sure that people don't fall into homelessness, because it's so much more difficult to get them out when that happens. Affordable housing. We have an affordable housing crisis in the state of California. Housing for everyone, frankly, not just our extremely low income folks, but people across the whole economic spectrum. So how do we make sure that we're investing in housing as quickly as easily as possible, so that as people experience homelessness, there's a place for people to live. And that, I think, so again, it's not just one solution. It's a combination of many things that we know work and putting those things together. Economic security. How are we going to be able to get folks into housing if they aren't able to find jobs that allow them to pay the rent.
Right, right.
50% of the folks that we serve at Hamilton are employed, and they're still experiencing homelessness because their wages
not enough.
aren't enough to take care of their rent and the other life expenses that they have.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
We have a tradition at the Cathedral to write questions on little note cards.
Of course.
So if anybody has questions on their note cards, then write them down and we can share them with Tomiquia. Oh, thank you. I was wondering about what kinds of misconceptions people have about homelessness today. You see these big encampments, and maybe you could talk a little bit about the encampments too. Just like, are they decreasing? Are they increasing? Are you more likely to be in an encampment if you're in homelessness in Los Angeles than if you're homeless in Stockton? Maybe you can talk a little bit about the visibility of homelessness and just what people are thinking.
Yes, so there has been an increase in encampments over the last 3 to 4 years. And I use the sort of story about when I was the chief of staff to Mayor Schaaf of Oakland, and we were working on a housing strategy for the entire city of Oakland. We brought in over 110 stakeholders to work over a year and a half to develop a housing strategy that addressed displacement and gentrification, that allowed for increasing the production of housing at all income levels, that looked at protections. How do we strengthen our renter protections to ensure that folks aren't displaced?
Yeah.
And how do we make sure that the existing housing stock that is affordable to people stays affordable? And so as we worked on that plan, homelessness was not a primary focus of that plan, and that was just 3 years ago.
Wow.
Or 4 years ago now.
Yeah.
And so the proliferation of folks experiencing homelessness on our streets is quite new, particularly in some communities like Oakland. And so one of the misconceptions I think people have is that folks who are homeless are not from their community. And we actually know that that's not accurate.
Yeah.
70% of folks in Alameda County were housed in Alameda County just a year before they were homeless. And so I think it's important for folks to recognize that although San Francisco and the Bay Area is known for sort of social services, resource, empathetic treatment and support, folks don't just come to the Bay Area and San Francisco because of those things. Many of our neighbors have lived in these communities and have deteriorated in place for a really long time. So that's one of the misconceptions I think that people have about who's experiencing homelessness. And also sort of again, I was speaking earlier about the sort of customization of interventions. When we say homeless, I think folks,
Well, when you say that, I realized a family member of mine was homeless at a certain point in her life, and I hadn't kind of put the one and one together. So so that continued. She lived in her van when she was for a year. When, she was kind of in transition between one life in one place and another life in another place. And
that's right.
Yeah, she's homeless.
Right. And so again, when you think about the visibility, you have to think about who you're not seeing, who's either who's homeless themselves or on the brink of homeless. We have probably 220,000 people who are housing insecure in our region, who are just a paycheck or a mental health breakdown or a physical
or even
challenge,
dependent on a relative member,
family member who might also exactly have issues. And so when you think about San Francisco versus Los Angeles, and Los Angeles has done a tremendous job in trying to figure out how to pull together those solutions to address the challenges that they're experiencing. But Los Angeles County is 428 square miles. Okay, that's huge. So you could go, I don't know, your whole month without seeing a person experiencing homelessness in walking to your grocery store, going to your neighborhood. Whereas again, in San Francisco, our city is 49 square miles. So it's really difficult to walk, and most of the services available to people who are experiencing homelessness are in 2 districts in our city.
Right.
So the concentration of people experiencing homelessness is quite contained in our downtown, whereas other communities, I think it is dispersed in a way that makes it less visible. So those are all elements of the visibility challenge, but not a true reflection of who actually is vulnerable in our community.
Yeah, that's so interesting, because you're right.
Yeah.
We see just the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah.
So I've got a bunch of questions, so we're going to
I
pick
know,
it up
look at
right
all the
here.
note
I know,
cards.
it's so great. What is your estimate of how many homeless do we have in San Francisco, and how many of them are permanently housed, and how many are in shelters? How many of them are employable?
Great question. So as I mentioned, we do a point-in-time count every other year in cities across the country. And as I said, San Francisco's count is about 7,000 to 8,000. I think it's an undercount. I think that there are probably 10 to 15,000 folks who are experiencing homelessness. The count, though, looks at folks who are in our shelters and who are on the streets. And so I do think that there's some variation in the folks who are less visibly homeless not being counted in that count. And so that's why we think that the numbers are a bit higher. What was the other part of the
How many
question?
are employable?
Oh,
Here's the question. If you want.
so again, I think if we recognize that people who experience homelessness are dynamic, many of them have been employed in their past, and circumstances have led to them not being able to work. Some folks have permanent disabilities and are not able to work. So I can only speak specifically to the folks that we work with at Hamilton, where I mentioned 50% of the folks that we work with are employed already. And many of the folks that we work with want to find sustainable employment. But again, if you're not, if you haven't had a job in a while because you had to watch your kids because you couldn't go to work, or you couldn't find childcare that you could afford, then you don't have the sort of sustained employment that employers look at in order to have you compete for a more competitive job. Those are some of the circumstances that people are experiencing. So it's not as simple as whether or not people can work. It's whether or not they're able to work given the conditions and circumstances that they're
their whole
under.
setting.
Yeah.
I had a question on my list too about Proposition C. Like, what's happening with Proposition C? I guess it's is it in the courts now?
It is. It is. Proposition C is, for those who may not know, passed this last November.
Yeah.
Was it
Oh my
November
gosh,
already?
yeah.
Lord. And it is a tax set aside for businesses whose revenues are $50 million and above, and those resources going to homelessness services and housing here in our city. They project it'll be about $300 million annually to support the work that's already happening. And because the measure passed with a simple majority, it's being contested.
So it's like 60%.
Yes,
And
but
the
it needs
question's
2/3
which is
to
66%.
not be tested in the court, but it only needed 50 plus 1 to pass.
Right.
So that's the litigation that's happening around Prop C. I think Prop C is an important resource to, as I said, reinforce that social safety net that is not intact in our city, and I'm hoping that those resources can really make sure that our shelter services, our transitional housing services, additional affordable housing for people who need permanent supportive housing, that is going to help tremendously in helping us invest in those critical services.
Right.
But I don't think it's the tool that's going to end the problem.
Right.
So
So
I
it's
think
not going to be the answer to
it's
it.
not the answer. It's part of the solution, and we're really happy that the voters were clear that this is a priority for them. But I think it's important for folks to recognize that there's a number of things that we need to get together in order to have a demonstrative impact on this issue. And Prop C is just the first piece.
Yeah. What are the best practices at a system level to address the income gaps in urban settings?
Gosh, I mean, part of the work that we do with families is increasing skills and competitiveness. So how do we connect them with workforce development programs, educational opportunities, entrepreneurial opportunities? What are the ways in which families can increase their household income as we provide the rental subsidy over a period of time, so that when the rental subsidy ends through Hamilton, the family is able to take it from there.
Right.
So what we're doing right now is doing a pilot at Hamilton, because what we started seeing is that families were having to look as far as Sacramento for housing that they can afford. And when that happens, folks are leaving their communities. They are rehousing in places that they don't have those connections.
Yeah.
And so part of what we're doing is providing longer term support, both on our rental subsidy side and case management support, to make sure that once a family finds housing, they're going to be able to stay housed.
Right.
That we're going to help them find what are the transportation options for you to use, so that doesn't become an over outsized burden in your household. How do you get childcare that you can afford, right? What church or community connections can you find? So we're really trying to strengthen our partnership model and working with whatever is available in those communities where people are housed, and how do we bring those together and wrap those around people so that they can have a better chance at long-term stability.
Oh, that's great. This is another question I've completely been thinking in my back of my head, just like how you talk about homelessness. So this question is, I notice you using this phrase, experiencing homelessness. Can you speak about that? So
Thanks for
think
that
I might
question.
know what the answer is, but it's a good one.
Well, the first thing I'll say is language matters.
It does.
Right? The way you talk and what you say matter. And so when we use the term people experiencing homelessness, we believe that homelessness should be rare, brief, and non-reoccurring. It is not an identity. Right? We do not subscribe to the notion that people are not able to overcome their housing crisis and figure out how to resolve it so that they can live healthy, productive lives. And I feel like we have, part of our capitalistic society, sort of relegates extremely low income people to a life of poverty. And we refute that. And when I use the term people experiencing homelessness, it's because I believe that folks can overcome it, and it does not define who they are.
Yeah, I love that. That's a great answer.
Yeah.
Do we need a second economy, a subsistence economy, to provide basic life needs, since the luxury economy is too expensive to live in?
Well, I think we need an integrated economy. I think we actually have to think about everything that we do, we've done on purpose. Systems are actually designed to produce outcomes that they're designed to produce. So there's no surprise that we have stark income inequality in our country.
Yeah, given the tax policies.
Come on.
Completely.
Given our housing policies. Matthew Desmond wrote the book Evicted,
exactly.
right? Which is fantastic for anybody who has not read it. It's sobering, but it's fantastic. And one of the recommendations that he talks about, because they've done the math on the budget of the Housing and Urban Development Department and the feds, and the subsidies through Section 8 and a variety of other housing programs, that if we just redesigned how we use those dollars, there's actually enough resources already to provide housing for everyone who needs it.
Yeah, that was amazing. I felt
Okay, I was like, why aren't we doing
even
this?
just as a housing as a human right.
Absolutely.
I mean, maybe you can talk a little bit about that too.
Yeah, and I think this question is sort of getting to it. It's like, if we don't have an integrated economy, there's never going to be a way for people to come to participate or move up or have opportunity in this existing economy.
Yeah.
And we can't continue to make that okay and not have honest conversations about what's perpetuating that reality.
Yeah,
and so for me, it's how do we get folks livable wage jobs? How do we make sure that there is housing that everyone can afford when they're doing the things that are expected of them
Right.
in the social contract that America has created,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
The
Yeah, if
American
you're working full time, you should be able to afford.
you should be
place
able to
live.
afford a place to live.
Yeah.
That notion should be a part of our economic strategy in America. And I don't think we need a separate economy. I think we need an integrated economy that focuses on righting the wrongs that perpetuated this stuff in the first place, like structural racism, like housing policies that straight up excluded people from their communities.
Yeah, exactly.
And recognizing that happened. That didn't just happen for some people, it happened for a lot of people. And how do we make it right?
Right. I mean, racism is such a deep part of this.
That's right.
I mean, basically, it's saying there's certain people that we just don't have to take care of, we don't have to worry about, and that's at the heart of this. It's just like basically not seeing human people, a person's dignity.
That's right. And if you ever wondered if that's true or not, you can just look at the numbers here in San Francisco. So folks experiencing homelessness, or the African American population here in San Francisco is about 5%.
Yeah.
The people between 4 and 6%, folks say, and yet the folks who are experiencing homelessness, 40% of them are African American.
That's terrible.
How's that possible?
Yeah,
right?
terrible.
There is something truly embedded in the way in which we
Well, there's so many at every point.
Exactly,
At
at
the point of
every-
education, at the point of job discrimination,
You
at
got
the
it.
point of housing discrimination. I mean, just all across the board. Can you speak to the incentive motivations of parents versus single adults to work to exit homelessness for the sake of their kids?
Well, I do think that families want the best they can for their children. It's natural and it's innate. And I think that folks are motivated around not wanting a future of poverty or homelessness for their children. Certainly we see that in our programs. I wouldn't say that I would do it as a binary comparison. I think there are plenty of single adults, young people, veterans, seniors who don't want to be homeless, right? And who are motivated in resolving their housing crisis. And I think it's much more unacceptable for a child who was born into homelessness to not want that for their future. And so families are motivated certainly by their children, but I think a lot of folks are motivated by wanting to live out their full potential and have access to opportunity to not just survive, but to thrive.
Yeah. If you meet someone on the street, what are your immediate solutions to keep them safe? In San Francisco, you can get them a warm drink, give them a blanket, get them to a hospital where they can get to a shelter for the evening, or through a HOT team.
Yes. When I see someone on the street, depending on what's going on for that person, we have access points here in San Francisco where folks who are living on the streets and need shelter can go directly and be assessed and be referred to shelter. So I often send folks directly to the access points if they need immediate shelter, if that's something they want. I think that folks, it depends on what folks are being asked. The other thing I do immediately is recognize people. When folks talk to you and they reach out, it's really awesome to look people in the eye and say hello and not ignore them. I think in terms of on-demand services, we don't have that in our system, right? And so if somebody says, hey, I need permanent housing, or, I need things that are going to take a longer time to get, I still refer them to the access point, because that's the way in which people get into our system then can begin to be triaged, and then we know what
So
their
where
needs
can we learn
are.
more? I mean, I just was thinking, like last night, I was talking to a friend of mine who's experiencing homelessness, and I see him all the time. And when things get bad, I do want to be able to. So what would I do to take? Where would I take him? Where would he go? Where's that access point? How do we learn more about it?
So Compass Family Services operates the Central City Access Point, and they're on Market Street in the city. They moved, so I'm not exactly sure of their address, but it's on the website for the Housing and Homelessness Department, so
Great.
folks can find that pretty easily. The hot team is also roving. There's also an access point in the Bayview that's run by Providence. And so those are really the places where folks can go directly to get assessed and figure out what their needs are. There's multiple places where folks can get a hot meal. You can go to Glide. I mean, so there are services available. 311 people can call, and they can let you know where to go if this situation is immediate. But I think if you have more ongoing persistent challenges, it's going to take people a while to kind of get into onto a path toward permanent housing, and the first step is getting into that access point.
Yeah. My friend he's struggling with alcohol. I mean, it's just. But anyway, I see him all the time. Is there any merit to the idea that if a community or region develops a stronger infrastructure for homelessness, that attracts more homeless people? So we talked a little bit about it, but maybe you want to give us one more summary answer to it.
Yeah, I don't, again, this notion of people being attracted to homelessness is odd to me. I think that community begets community. People feel safe when they're around each other. We know that community bonds happen when folks are in shared spaces, even in our encampments and on the streets. So we recognize that those community bonds are super strong, and that when people are accessing resources, there's a word of mouth. You tell somebody if you like something, you tell somebody about it, and you want them to access it too. So all of those dynamics happen for people experiencing homelessness. I don't know that I would say that folks are drawn from other places necessarily to do that unless there are safety issues. We know that young people actually come to San Francisco because it's a safe haven for our LGBTQ youth who are experiencing homelessness and have fled violence. And so there's some communal dynamics that I think people are drawn to. But I think in terms of, a choice around coming to a place just to get services is a little strange to me. I think community forms around those resources and that happens, but I don't know if I subscribe to that notion.
Yeah. I wonder how it's been for you just going from the mayor's office to this new role. I mean, in the mayor's office, this was probably an element of the work that you did.
Right.
And now it's just like the whole thing.
Yes.
I mean, how has that been? I mean, do you miss some of the work that you did before, or are you just glad to just be more focused?
That's such a great question, especially for somebody like me. I feel like I'm a pluralistic person.
Yeah.
Like I tend to really not see life in silos, and I work really hard to look at the connection between systems and how people got there. When I was a social worker, and I was working one-on-one with people, right, and resolving whatever was going on.
I bet you were great at that, by the way.
Thank
You just have such skills.
Thanks.
Yeah, definitely.
But what was hard for me is that I would help you get your life together and figure out how to figure
get
it
my
out.
employment job.
Right. And then I'd have to go help the next person because the system was just giving me more people to help. So I feel like my favorite thing about being in a mayor's office or working in government is that you get to look at the broader picture. You're not just sort of looking at how is Hamilton as a direct service provider providing the best quality services we can for the families we serve, which is key.
Right.
And I want to live in a world where I don't have to keep getting referrals to children and families experiencing homelessness.
Exactly.
And so it's up to me to think about how do I use my experience having worked in government, looking at, our economy, our workforce, our transportation policies, our other pieces, and bringing that broader perspective together in the vision for San Francisco and the Bay Area that people deserve.
Yeah, I like it. I never thought about it, but in a way, you're kind of in between those two places.
Indeed.
Of that social worker with the person right in front of you, in the mayor's office with the whole city government at your disposal, and you're kind of in between that, in a place that seems really, really well suited for you.
It's definitely. It provides a lot of agility to build on sort of the assets of both communities and try to bring together better impact.
Yeah, exactly. Well, we have one last question. The question is, how can we help? Which I thought is a good one.
That's a great way to close us out, actually.
Yeah, isn't it?
So again, I think on the sort of more acute needs, volunteering with organizations like Hamilton, Compass, Larkin
Grace
Street,
Cathedral.
Grace Cathedral.
Episcopal Community Services.
Exactly. I mean, there are tons and tons of us who are working together in partnership with one another that could absolutely use your support. And so that's one way. I think it's important for, your employees. There are a lot of people who are very concerned about what homelessness represents for our community and want to get involved. And so encouraging your colleagues and your employers to take action is really important. I think that we can also say yes to housing. We have a housing shortage, and it's important for us to build and preserve and sustain housing at all income levels. And I think we have some really interesting dissonance in our community when some folks are anti-housing because they don't want housing in their neighborhoods, but they're really frustrated with the homelessness challenges that we have in our city. We have to reconcile those two realities and allow housing to be built at incomes that people can afford. And so it's a really important, and a way to do that is go to your council or go to your Board of Supervisors hearing. When you see a project coming up, go support it because it matters. We want, diverse voices helping us raise up the needs of people experiencing homelessness in our community, and democracy is one of the ways to do that. So get involved, write letters to your governor, and talk about how important it is for him to prioritize housing. That's what he's thinking about, and he wants to hear from us.
Right.
So I think those are some really specific ways for us to get involved. And the last one I'll say is, it sort of reminds me of the sort of values that I learned from my grandmother, which is no one person can be successful in our society when other members of our society are struggling. And so how do we take a much more holistic approach of what success looks like, and making sure that we bring up our most vulnerable so that everybody has a chance to thrive.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Thanks.
Well, we have... We're coming to the end of our time, and I have to go upstairs because I have to preach a sermon. And all of you are welcome
That
to come
small
up and
thing?
join me. Oh, that
okay.
little thing. Next week, our guest will be Patrick Makuakane. He's the hula master and an innovative choreographer. I would never say that. He's a kumu hula. But he'll be here to talk about the beauty and cultural relevance of Hawaiian hula and his transformative work with prisoners at San Quentin, my wife's native Hawaiian. So
Oh, my goodness.
I can't wait till this guy comes next week. You're welcome to join us for the 11 o'clock service. We also, if you can make a gift on your way out, we have a little glass box there that helps support our programs. And I just feel like you were so warm in helping us to see this very complicated problem and to help clarify so many questions that we have. So thank you very much to
My
Tomiquia
pleasure.
Moss for being here.
Thank you so much.